Hello and welcome. Our focus for this webinar is teaching and learning in primary schools. At the time of recording, the beginning of June 2020, pupils in some year groups around the world are starting to return to school. Many remain at home, and many will still not get to see their teachers, school friends, or the inside of a classroom until several weeks or even months into the future. In this webinar, we are going to look at how to encourage independent learning skills in primary age children while schools are closed and when they reopen. My name is Paul Ellis and I'm Head of Teaching and Learning at Cambridge Assessment International Education. Our guest presenter for this webinar is Dr. Alison Borthwick, education consultant, author, and one of our lead trainers. Alison has worked all over the world advising schools, ministries of education and learning enterprises on a wide range of topics. Her specialism is mathematics and primary and lower secondary teaching. She has co-written 4 books, one of which is called Reasons to Reason in Primary Maths and Science. This book sets out in detail the theory and practice of some of what she is going to talk about in this webinar. I would now like to introduce Alison, who will take you through the rest of this webinar.
Thank you, Paul, and hello everybody. Thank you also to Cambridge International for inviting me to participate in this webinar. So let me begin by setting the scene for the context and content I aim to cover. So you can see on the screen that there are 3 aims. While there are many ways for teachers to teach and learners to learn, the ability to be able to draw on and use independent skills is certainly a key one, and for any age of learners. And I do want to stress that when we're talking about learners, at the moment I'm really meaning that all learners are able to be independent, whatever their age. It is how they use and develop these skills which is the focus of this webinar today. The second aim refers to the situation that we currently find ourselves in currently with COVID-19, where many of our learners have been working remotely and many still are. And to be clear, when I refer to home learning or remote learning, I mean that learners are in a different place to their teacher. However, we are entering into a period of transition where some schools and countries are beginning to reintegrate their learners back into school. And it's my aim that this webinar supports both home learning and school learning in relation to fostering and developing independent skills, even begins to offer a bridge between the two. And finally, the third area of this webinar will focus on how teachers can enable, develop, foster and maintain independent skills for their learners wherever they are learning. I'm going to give some practical tips that can be applied across any of the 10 subjects available within the Cambridge primary and lower secondary programmes. So let's start by thinking about the current situation. As Paul alluded to, it is the 4th of June today. And so at the moment, a majority of learners are still working and learning at home. By now, we all know that there are opportunities and challenges to this situation. For example, one opportunity has been the increase in flexibility in what we ask learners to do. Flexibility in tasks, flexibility in the time of day that learners complete the task, flexibility in how they complete the tasks. But on the other hand, there are challenges too. For example, it is more difficult for teachers to notice if learners are struggling or becoming disengaged with their learning. So here are a few areas to consider, both the opportunities and the challenges that learners have been presented with. So, as I've already mentioned, the structure of learning can be more flexible, but the challenge is that learners may struggle to adapt and follow this unfamiliar structure currently at home, particularly if their independent skills are not developed or practiced. Thinking about routines, for some learners they will have routines set for them by parents or carers, but for others perhaps not. And the challenge is to create and stick to a routine. And again, being able to draw on independent skills is key here for learners. And that is really applicable too when they start to transition back into school. Thinking about the teacher and the role of the teacher in this situation, we know that there are lots of opportunities that teachers have been able to adopt in this situation. They have been able to think more creatively and adapt school resources and tasks to allow all learners to be able to engage with them. Talking to many teachers in this current situation, they've really enjoyed this and have welcomed this opportunity. However, one of the challenges is that remote learning can narrow communication between the teacher and the learner and potentially place more emphasis on parents and carers. For some learners, their levels of independence increases, they are left to complete work on their own, for example, but for other learners, their levels may decrease as the ratio of adult to learner increases to often a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 ratio, and therefore the opportunity to practice independent skills is diminished. And finally, thinking about opportunities and challenges posed by peers of learners. Being independent doesn't mean working on your own. Often working with others allows greater independent skills to develop because we have more opportunities to think and reason through ideas with others. Our peers will often motivate and encourage us to keep going, or perhaps even challenge us in a healthy, competitive way. And clearly a challenge of remote learning is the lack of opportunity for learners to work collaboratively. Not impossible, but it's certainly been a little bit more difficult. So those two previous slides have alluded to some of the characteristics that independent skills offer. So back to the question, what does it mean to be able to work independently? Before we start to answer that question, what I would like to do is just take a moment, let's pause and think about why it is important for learners to develop these independent skills. Solving problems is at the heart of all learning. We're solving a problem when we decide which colour to use in a painting, or how to structure a piece of writing, or which strategy to use to employ for solving a maths problem. So we know that however we view problems, they are central to our ways of life, and whether we are working at home or working at school. We are also all very unique and different, and this means that we solve problems in different ways. Being successful is much more than just learning topics, routines and facts. It's about having the tools to use for any situation or problem. And therefore, developing independence and those independent skills is absolutely key to solving problems, because these skills will allow us to solve problems, but in our own way. So let's return to that question. What does it mean to be able to work independently? It is complex, as the slide suggests, and there are many factors involved in acquiring, developing, improving and maintaining independent skills. And these may include some of those examples that I've popped on the screen. So for example, we might need to think about the motivation, the social needs, the communication, verbal and non-verbal, past experiences, trial and adjustment, and certainly the evaluation of the effects of our actions will also help us to set personal goals and recognise when we have achieved them. And I recognise that there are many, many more things that we need to consider here. And of course, as you're listening to this, you might like to add to that list as well. But it is also through random experiences and opportunities and situations and the evaluation of these that also allow us to develop independence. So thinking about different learners being able to solve things in a different way, using different routines is key, because although we often as teachers are offering tasks and questions to our learners that eventually will achieve the same results, it's important to recognise that our learners can use different paths, different routines to get to that same result. So let's not forget that much of learning is by observing and imitating and testing and adjusting. So I'd like to pose you a question while you're listening to this. Do we as teachers create situations that allow learners to sit back and observe? Do we praise them and reward them for imitating behaviour and actions? Do we encourage them to try and test and adjust and retry? Because actually all of those things are going to start allowing and enabling our learners to become a little bit more independent at the moment. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the detail of what the characteristics could be for primary age learners in order to work independently. And I've used a picture of an umbrella to suggest that independent skills is a broad term that we might use for what I guess we're describing as these habits of learning. So what we're going to focus on now are some of the strands that might fit into or indeed underneath this umbrella. Of course, there are many skills that we could have chosen. However, I have chosen to focus on these 4, which I do believe are particularly prevalent for learners. So you'll notice that we're thinking about thinking and reasoning as a skill, reflection, motivation, and resilience and perseverance. Now, at the time of recording this webinar, June 2020, many learners are still learning remotely, as the 2 slides on opportunities and challenges highlighted a little earlier on. And without a certain level of independence, learners may face challenges, and perhaps more challenges than opportunities. But what I really want to think about is that as we start to think about what happens when schools reopen, it's really important to say that these skills are just as important in the school context as they are in the home context. The fact is that these are lifelong skills. So the next few slides will explore each of the 4 skills in more detail and offer some suggestions as to how to plan and enable these skills within teaching and learning contexts. I couldn't resist including a picture of a cake because actually it's a really good example just to remind us that when we're talking about independent skills, there are many layers. And again, we've chosen 4 to focus on today, but all of those 4, just as in the cake, are all together and they're all very much independent and relying on each other. And together they make up a really good broad picture of what it means to be independent. So let's think about our first one, thinking and reasoning. So you'll notice that I've grouped these 2 words, these 2 characteristics, these 2 skills together. And although I have grouped them together, I'm very much of the opinion that they are different. So thinking can be random, it can be blue sky thinking, it can be disconnected, it can be great. However, compared to reasoning, which I would define as more purposeful, more logical, and more goal orientated. And I do think that in order to be able to read and reason competently and confidently, you also need to be able to engage in a level of thinking. That said, I am going to use the 2 terms interchangeably for the purpose of this presentation. So let's start by considering perhaps what a lack of thinking and reasoning might mean, because I think sometimes it's really helpful to think about what this skill brings by thinking about the absence of what it might lack. So a lack of thinking and reasoning could mean that learners become disengaged with tasks, perhaps they become bored, become frustrated. So how can we purposefully encourage, develop and enable thinking and reasoning for learners? Well, I've put 5 suggestions on the slide. And the first one starts with that phrase that we use a lot, that actually being able to give learners open tasks and not closed tasks is a really helpful way to enable thinking and reasoning. So if we think about a closed task, often closed tasks are very limited in the answers or the solutions that we're looking for. They often only have one answer that's available, compared to open tasks, which can allow for multiple solutions, lots of different ways of thinking, but also lots of ways of reasoning about coming to a task. So already you can start to see that offering more open-ended tasks as opposed to closed tasks is going to start enable our learners to think and reason. Also involved in that is about giving learners that voice that we often talk about, giving the student voice, the learner voice, and getting them to make some decisions. So as a teacher, we might set up and create opportunities for learning to happen, but we don't always have to over scaffold. Often by saying to the learners, this is what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to write a piece of writing on whatever it is, but you decide what you're going to put in it. You decide how long or how short it's going to be. You make those decisions. And in making those decisions, we're enabling learners to begin thinking and then moving their thinking into reasoning so that it becomes purposeful, logical, and goal orientated. Taking risks. Learners love taking risks. And again, what taking risks encourages them to do is to think and be really creative and innovative with their approaching. It's also really positive to encourage the growth mindset, the curiosity, and the positive dispositions, all associated with what we know is to be really successful learning. So let's get our learners to take some risks, but we need to be able to model that as well for them. And taking a risk, saying to them, why did you choose to do that? Tell me what you were thinking there. Can you reason to somebody else about how that felt? If we don't take risks, we stay too safe, and therefore we are limiting the thinking and the reasoning. You can already probably hear that curiosity coming out. Being able to evoke curiosity for our learners is a wonderful thing. And again, it's about thinking and reasoning about what the tasks are going to be and really trying to think from a learner perspective so that we give them tasks, we offer them tasks that are curious because that curiosity can evoke that thinking and a reasoning. And really that does link into that wondering. I wonder what would happen if. I wonder if I tried to do it in this way. I wonder if I could take a risk. So we can start to see that those 5 areas on the slide are really powerful areas that we can enable as teachers, but that would really cause some positive and powerful thinking and reasoning for our learners. Let's move on to the second area that I want to talk to you about, which is reflection. And reflection, again, with all of these, is a really key characteristic in developing independent skills for our primary age learners. Reflection helps learners to understand themselves as learners. It allows them to develop awareness and strategies to be lifelong learners. So let's for a minute and just think about what would a lack of reflection mean? And I think a lack of reflection could mean that learners may just simply follow the rules. And as teachers, we are very good at setting rules. We're very good at setting rules for social and emotional dispositions, but we're also very good at setting rules about how to complete the work, how to carry out the work, how to collaborate with peers. And while on the one hand, we need to do a certain level of setting rules, when it comes to thinking about developing independence, if our learners are simply following rules, we're not really allowing them that opportunity to reflect. It also often means that learners rush through tasks because actually we haven't given them any opportunities to stop, to pause, to reflect. And as a result, this can sometimes develop low self-esteem because we haven't asked them to celebrate what they've been doing. We haven't asked them to celebrate whether they were taking a risk or whether they have been curious about something. So what can we think about that will enable us to develop this strand of independence in terms of reflection. So that first bullet point on the slide, it seems obvious, but my question to you would be, how often do we make sure and ensure that all tasks build in that reflective time? Schools are very busy places. Teachers are telling me all the time, we don't have time to get through the curriculum. We need to do this, we need to go at a certain pace. And that's true. But the power of just pausing and taking and building in reflective moments is very, very important. And we do have time. We can build in those questions, really simple questions like, what do you notice? What have you thought about? Have you seen any patterns? And I'm going to come back to thinking about effective questions a little bit later on in the presentation. But really do take the time and do give the time in terms of the work that we're setting and the reflection about the tasks that we're asking learners to do. So that really does tie into that second bullet point, giving tasks that require learners to think, reason and review their work. And that review, that ability to go back and to draft and redraft is really, really important. And we can do that through a variety of ways. We can ask them, once they've completed the work, to go back and take some notes, or perhaps record a short video, or maybe even write a blog, or have a conversation, or do some role play. Those are just a few ideas. You will have plenty more, I know, but those are just giving you some ideas about how we can ask learners to stop, pause, think and review about the work that they've completed. And let's not forget that also we are role models for our learners. So let's give them examples of how to reflect by posing questions, by completing tasks alongside your learners, because that then gives us an opportunity to say, I'm really pleased with how I started this piece of work, but I wish that I'd thought about doing something else. Or I think if I did this again, what I would do is. So it's really, really important to model that element of reflection, because quite often being reflective, we tend to think of as being an internal, silent, non-communicative skill. So how do our learners know what reflection is? How do they know how to improve that reflection? Let's move on to our third area that we're thinking about under the umbrella of independent skills, and that's motivation. And we aspire for all our learners to be interested, engaged and curious, so they are keen to learn new skills as well as improving existing ones. Again, let's pause and just think about what a lack of motivation might do, so that then we're all super keen to be able to make sure that we do include it. So that lack of motivation can mean that learners engage with tasks superficially, so they're completing them perhaps just because you've asked them to, but they don't really have any reason to complete them. They haven't got any purpose, and therefore that motivation starts to wane. Perhaps they don't enjoy the tasks. And I guess we all know that if we don't enjoy tasks, it is harder, not impossible, but it is harder to motivate ourselves a little bit more. And therefore, we can then be left with feeling dissatisfaction in the completion of the tasks. We might have completed the task, but we don't feel great about it. We certainly don't want to go back and reflect on it or think about it and reason about it. So we can start to see that motivation, along with the other two we've talked about, is really important in developing that independence. So I want to talk a little this moment about task design. And I would encourage everybody just to think a little bit differently. Now let's draw on the home context and the remote learning that we've all been doing currently. Because in talking to teachers, you have become brilliant at being creative and being innovative towards the tasks that you have been asking your learners to complete at home. Mostly because home learning is very, very different to school learning. We can't just ask them to complete tasks that we would have asked them to complete in the school context. So we have been thinking a little bit differently. But hasn't it been great? Don't you feel empowered that actually just thinking a little bit differently about the tasks that we ask our learners to complete, whether it's drawing on the home situation that they've got, whether it's being a little bit more creative about how to do some science in the home, or noticing mathematics everywhere, or perhaps motivating our learners to write something, but in terms of the purpose for them. I think it's very empowering. And that task design basically is really helping to place the activities and the tasks in the context, in the centre of the learner, so that they're motivated. I think the second point is that I've already alluded to the fact that we are very good as teachers at setting rules, at giving instructions, and sometimes we're a little bit too good at over scaffolding tasks. So of course we do need to scaffold tasks, but we need to try and think about creating a balance between scaffolding a task so that our learners know enough of what they need to do, but also giving them enough freedom to make mistakes, to take some risks, to be able to reason. And finally, really going back up to that first bullet point of task design, let's be responsive to our learners. So if we know that certain things that we do, whether it's personally or professionally, if we know that certain things motivate us and other things don't, what is it that motivates our learners? Why don't we ask them? It would be really helpful to be able to say to our learners, what tasks did you really enjoy when I was setting for you when you were working remotely? Let's find out from then what their ultimate task was, which was the task that they absolutely loved. And of course, it will be different for all of them, but it will give us an insight into what motivates them. Because let's be honest, they are probably going to be motivated by things that are a little bit different to what you and I would be motivated for. So let's build on that. Let's use that as a positive. Let's be responsive in order so that we can motivate our learners, because that will help them to develop these skills of independence. The final and fourth skill under the umbrella of independence that I want to talk to you about today is resilience and perseverance. And these two skills, or learning habits, are very desirable, and yet learners often resist them. I am sure you have heard learners say things like, I can't, or it's too hard, or I don't know what to do. So again, for the final time, let's pause and have a think about what would a lack of resilience and perseverance mean? And the research tells us that actually, if learners struggle to find resilience and to persevere with tasks, it can mean that they find it difficult to concentrate. And perhaps they only have one way of solving a problem. And we've already noticed that only having one way of solving a problem is not particularly helpful for developing independent skills. So, what can we do to really enable our learners to develop and become even better at resilience and perseverance? Because there are certain aspects of their lives that they are very resilient and and have perseverance with. And again, it might be worth just pausing and reflecting on those areas. So thinking about longer tasks, it's something that in school we're often a little bit constrained to do because our subjects and our school day is organised into blocks of time. We often don't have the luxury of being able to take 2 hours or a whole day or even several days to really give tasks that demand that level of time and that level of thinking and reasoning. Now, it may be that during this time of COVID-19 and enabling our learners to do tasks at home, we've been able to use those opportunities. So perhaps you have been setting longer tasks such as projects and research tasks, and that's a really positive thing. So it would be interesting to see how your learners responded to those. Were they able to demonstrate that resilience and perseverance? Because there is nothing to stop us taking and considering longer tasks once we start to think about what will happen when schools begin to reopen. Just because we have a school day that says we have to finish, I don't know, science within this period of time, we can always maybe think a little bit creatively about either how to extend that, not necessarily within one day, but over several days. But certainly longer tasks enable and give learners opportunities to develop resilience and perseverance. Something to think about also is that second bullet point, asking learners to design their own learning. And this really ties into that previous skill we were talking about with motivation. Because if we want them to be resilient and we want them to dig deep and find that perseverance, let's go back to them. Let's ask them to design their own learning. Of course, it can be within your parameters of perhaps a science experiment or a mathematical investigation or a piece of creative writing. But again, less scaffolding, more ownership for them will allow them to perhaps use that resilience and perseverance. Providing a reason to complete the work. I don't know about you, but I get asked quite a lot by learners and teachers, why do we have to do whatever it is they're doing? And sometimes it's really hard to come up with that. Sometimes it's really hard, but it's just on page 24, or it just is part of the music curriculum or whichever curriculum you're drawing from. So sometimes it might be really kind of worth thinking about, well, what is the reason for completing this work? Because if you can't think of a really positive reason, then it might be that your learners resort to thinking, well, it is difficult and I'm lacking that motivation, and therefore it's hard to find that resilience and perseverance. And finally, I've already mentioned it a couple of times in this webinar, but allowing learners to get stuck and then unstuck and then maybe stuck again, making mistakes and trying to figure your way through problems is really powerful. Now, from my mathematical background, I see a lot of learners not really applying resilience and perseverance because they are presented with a problem, they have a go, they get stuck, they can't do it. And therefore, they are often used to then asking for help or being given scaffolding. But maybe, just maybe sometimes we have to say, are you stuck? That's great, brilliant, because now you can really start to think about how to get unstuck. And do you know what? I'm going to give you all lesson, because that's drawing on the resilience and the perseverance. I'm going to give you all lesson to try and figure out how to get unstuck. And you know what? If you don't, it doesn't matter, because you have learnt some really important skills along the way. Because of course, learning is not just about finding the answers. In fact, learning is more about finding your way and your route through the answers. So think that perseverance and resilience really does require learners to think, to reason, to reflect, and to be motivated. Good thinkers are resilient. They don't give up easily. They reflect on what they're learning and they are motivated to work hard and keep going, particularly when faced with challenges. So I hope at this point you have a real sense of some of those skills that I'm sure you're already doing, but really some of the practical things that we can think about and why we should think about developing them and how you might develop them either in the current situation of remote learning, but also when schools start to think about reopening, as some already have, and how we can move those skills and those independent skills back into a school learning context. So the last part of this webinar is going to consider that question. How can teachers continue to foster independent skills in primary age children? And this is whether you are supporting your children remotely or in a school context. And I'm going to present 3 slides for you. The first one is on curriculum. So I do think it's really important to think about the curriculum that you're offering at home. And we've already talked about using opportunities, perhaps thinking about the home situation and the home context. And I am sure that you have been thinking about task design. But when you start to move back into schools as well, really think about the curriculum that you're drawing on and whether it is going to really help develop and promote those independent skills that we've been talking about. It is absolutely fine to adapt the schemes of work, and actually anybody would expect you to do that. So do feel free to look at those subjects and to think about what do I really need to do for my learners. The schemes of work are there as a framework for you, but it is much more about thinking about the route than the skills, rather than just getting through the content. It is really about what your learners need to be successful in school and in higher education and in life in general. And we know that those independent skills are a bedrock for that. It might be that when you're thinking about the curriculum, you need to consider and perhaps even move the time frame. We know that we've lost a certain amount of time through remote learning. And you know what? It's absolutely fine. Your learners will recover, your curriculum will recover. This is not a case of when your learners return trying to cram in all of the curriculum that they've lost, because you can start to think that if we do that, there's not going to be very much time for developing those independent skills. And if we really value those independent skills, and we do, then it might be that we need to adapt and consider about moving timeframes of the curriculum. And so that last point is really important. If we focus less on content and we focus more on skills, actually, the research says that our learners will actually do better with the content as well. So don't be afraid to really think about and move around and play with those curriculums and those schemes of work in the light of developing independent skills. The second area that I want to talk to you about is the importance of rich tasks. And the selection of tasks we give to learners is particularly key when we're thinking about developing those independent skills. Often tasks can fall into the instructive or procedural category. In other words, drill and practice, a predetermined task where often only one response is required, compared to tasks that are open-ended and offer learners opportunities to construct and build up their knowledge. So thinking about the open tasks as opposed to closed tasks, which I've mentioned a few minutes ago, is really important. A key pedagogical strategy that Cambridge particularly encourages, and I'm really pleased that it does, is the use of more active than passive learning. And this is because active learning encourages learners to think and think harder. Tasks that allow for multiple solutions are encouraging learners to be resilient and to employ that perseverance. Such tasks are designed to promote thinking and reasoning and employ strategies such as working systematically, looking for patterns. In other words, equipping them to be effective lifelong learners. And finally, those tasks that encourage learners to think and to reason and to reflect and not just copy and complete. Those are particularly rich tasks. So task design is really important when we're thinking about developing independent skills. And the third area I wanted to talk about is effective questions. And I promised that I would come back and I would share some questions with you, and this is the slide. So to begin with, teachers can and should model effective questions, such as the ones included on the slide. And you will notice that I have included some of my favourites. What do you notice? Tell me about. What happens when? But over time, this could and should shift to learners asking these questions of themselves and of their peers and of the tasks. Remember, we are a mirror to our learners, so let's model good practice. So, what should we not expect? It's not going to be an overnight quick fix. I am really hoping that I've really inspired you all to think just a little bit more about independent skills, but it's not going to be a quick fix. Often learners have deep-seated habits, and that's going to take time to change. So just give yourselves that time and give yourselves that reflection and those moments of pause where you can think, actually, maybe 3 days ago or 3 months ago, they weren't doing something, but actually I can now notice that my learners have become a little bit more resilient. Or, why was it that they were motivated by that task? So quick fixes, no, but certainly look for moments that we can celebrate. I wish there was a magic bullet, but there isn't a magic bullet, and there is not one particular skill that is more important than the others. So as you've heard me talking about those 4 skills that we've looked at today, you will see that they all work together. They are all dependent and interdependent of each other. And finally, I've mentioned a few times that what I'm talking about is drawn on research, but it's not a popular trend. Actually, the skills that are offered are drawn from evidence and research. It's not just something that we heard last week or that's had a one-time success offer. So it's just important, I think, to set ourselves the reality of this is such a key area for our learners, and it's going to take time, but if we do it well, we're going to develop and enable some powerful independent learners. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Cambridge Learner attributes may have been noticing and reflecting throughout this webinar to the similarity posed by the independent skills we've talked about today and those 5 learner attributes. Now, I could pause and ask you to think about them, but they are on the screen. So for those of you who need a reminder, they're on the slide. Oops, I'll just go back. They're on the slide for you with a brief description of each of them. And these 5 attributes were chosen because they support the development of powerful and highly desirable learning habits that aim to inspire learners to love learning. There are many connections and similarities to the independent skills that I've been talking to you about today. And the 2 sets of skills, the independent skills and the Cambridge Learner attributes, are not in conflict with each other. Quite the opposite. They complement and support each other very well. Just as the Cambridge Learner attributes are interdependent and should be viewed as a whole, so too should the independent skills that I've been presenting today. And with both sets of skills, our learners are definitely set on a path of success. So finally, as we start to approach the end of this webinar, let's again pause and reflect what independent learning does not equate to or offers us. And I think the title in this slide is really powerful, that independent learning does not mean working alone. Central to the success of settling back into school learning is recognising and acknowledging the learning that has been achieved at home. It's also highlighting to learners the success that they have achieved, often through being able to draw on their independent skills, perhaps rather than heaps of knowledge that they've learnt or retained. So let's really take a moment when we finally get our learners back into school, as some of you already have, just to stop and celebrate some of the things that they've been doing while they've been at home, but also let's help them to make the connections to some of those independent skills that we've been doing. And finally, the idea that success does breed success. So let's make sure that we really encourage and enable our learners to recognise the ways in which they have been successful at home as they begin to transition back into schools. So while remote learning has encouraged the development of online educational technologies, flexible working and new pedagogical models to engage with, the need for learners to be able to work independently has not changed. If anything, this skill is even more a necessity than it was before. So as we think about transitioning from home learning to school learning, considering how to foster and develop independent skills, I think we now realise that it is even more key. Independence, just as education, does not begin or end in the classroom. So let's turn our attention to ensuring that this generation of learners are ready for the next global challenge by making sure that their independent skills are as powerful and as developed as they can be. And so I'd like to leave you with a challenge. As we start to end this webinar, I'd like to encourage you to notice which tasks or activities you particularly enjoy or feel accomplished or pleased with. And now try and identify which of the independent skills you were using and drawing on in the task and how it was set up. So thank you very much. I hope you're all well, and please do keep safe.